Hey all, we're back. This is part two of 9/11, the catalyst for Cold War 2.0. This is the next episode. I'm here with my son, Nicholas, or Nico, as we call him. And he's been giving us great information on this history from the end of World War II, and then he's going to go up to the whole thing with 9/11 and up to the present, really, of what's going on. And so oops, you got a kitty visiting. We have so many, right? You always see mine, but you don't see her too often. So anyway, go ahead and we were talking about APAC.
hmm
It came into it came around, I think you said 1962, and that would have been during JFK's time, but you're saying that it was a different time.
Well, there needs to be a little bit of clarification because um, it was 1963, it was formally established. However, it was started and founded in 1951.
Mm.
And there's some really interesting stuff. So, APAC stands for those that don't know, American Israel Public Affairs Committee. That was the one that was formally established in 1963, excuse me. But its roots go back earlier. So what we're talking about when it like was founded, it was a lobbying group that was called, and I'm just going to say the name, what it was, but it was called the American Zionist Committee for Public Affairs, which was founded in 1951 by Isaiah L. Kennan. So basically, it was a group that was focused on promoting pro Israel policies in the US after Israel's creation in 1948. Something that I found interesting when I was learning about this was the fact that just a few years after the creation of this state, here they are already trying to have a lobbying group, in the US. And I just thought that was just kind of curious because why is a state trying so hard to, lobby to someone like the United States who had really no previous connections or serious connections? So that was one of the first questions that popped into my head, and it gets more interesting from here. So um, it reframes a lot of things because of what happens in the um, the 1960s, which I kind of talked about the Six Day War and also the space race that was going on and stuff like that. And it was very strongly suggested that Israel does not like Russia very much. Um, they've had a lot of tensions historically for different reasons, and I'm not going to get into that because that's a whole rabbit hole in and of itself. But um, so basically, um, as we know, that AIPAC's been a pretty powerful lobbying group in the U.S. government. They are obviously, it's from what I've been learning, it seems like it's probably the most powerful lobbying group in the United States, from what I have seen. Could be wrong, but considering how much we kind of do things on Israel's behalf and stuff like that, I am inclined to believe there is a pretty strong holding. And, this happens, and it's not just, that's just the way lobbying is, it's wherever the money is. So I'm not saying this is a issue unique to Israel. So um, one of the things that I was kind of wondering was I was learning about um, Apollo and the Apollo mission and wondering why it was so, you know, important. And you see, the space race was a very important time because back when I was saying about the competition between America and the Soviet Union, there was this attempt to try to win over certain allies on the Middle East towards Moscow. And in order to do that, they were trying to show that, oh, look, we have this technology and stuff like that. So in the space race, we may remember that Russia had been winning, so to speak, in terms of this. With like 1957, Sputnik was the first artificial satellite. And then in 1961, Yuri Gagarin, the first human in space. And then, of course, later we had the first spacewalk, first probes to the moon and Venus, and so on. Um, and so, what we need to understand is at that time when propaganda was rampant, because that's what the Cold War had, um, these were all like firsts and they were like big wins for Russia. And so, for countries that were wondering who to side with, Washington or Moscow, countries within Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, um, these wins for Russia were very important. And when we look at Israel, who does not like Russia at that time and was very concerned about Russia, and, of course, it could be for legitimate reasons or other reasons. I'm just saying there was general concern. They definitely did not want Russia there and being involved. And what's interesting is the moon landing, of which was the big accomplishment of America, and that was spread and such. In 1969, that took place. And this wasn't just about bragging rights, it really undercut Russia's image in the leader in science and tech. And, it basically made, communism look inferior to democracy, which then helped sway Arab states and such towards Washington and away from the Soviets. So, why exactly is that important? Should be, of course, the question on all of our minds. Why does any of this matter? Why does it, why should we care? Why should we care if Arab states were on our side or not? Well, because we didn't want Russia to have control over the Middle East. We wanted control. And this, took place in the Afghan wars and stuff with and our supplying weapons and stuff. Um, of course, the other question is, well, why would Israel care about any of this? Well, if Arab nations move away from Moscow and towards the West, there's less of a hostile threat towards Israel because, of course, as we know, there was the tension between Russia and Israel historically and stuff like that. Um, and so by humiliating Russia through this feat, we'll call it, um, it really made Russia look worse in the Middle East. So I don't know if you want to say anything before I continue on, but I think it's a
Yeah, I
pretty,
think it makes sense.
mhm. Yeah, it's one of those cases too where, and I know some people are going to be like, well, what are you inferring, And I want to clarify and say, I'm not trying to infer anything. I'm just saying this is history. This is what it achieved. Then you may, of course, if you notice, like I am, that this seems to be achieving multiple things at once, you may also be wondering, well, if there was a lot of propaganda going at that time, was the Apollo mission a propaganda piece? Not saying it is, not saying it isn't. I'm just saying something to think about. Um, so and the reason why this is so important is because it's so necessary for understanding the build up towards 9/11 and the mindset of the Cold War and what we were trying to achieve in the Middle East, and that the Apollo mission is very strongly hinted and suggested towards achieving that. So that's why I bring it up. um,
Well, that was a big deal. The space race thing.
mm-hmm,
Um, we knew that even television shows had
mm-hmm,
stuff like that on. Um, shows that I grew up on. In the 70s,
mm-hmm.
it was all about what what are we doing to get ahead of the USSR? Because I remember that, the Soviets.
Yep. And something interesting to note, before the moon landing, which was in 69,
Hmm.
the Six-Day War that was carried out by Israel on, you know, Egypt, Syria, and other Arab states was in 1967, a few years before the Apollo mission. So, just something worth
When
noting in the
when they
timeline.
when they that's the war that they were who were they fighting against, the Egyptians?
uh, Egypt was the one that basically spurred on the preemptive strike, which then devolved into a whole lot of other stuff, which I can get into in a bit.
Right, because um and that was 6 days, you said?
Yes, it
Okay.
was a very short war because it was Israel, to be blunt, pretty much obliterated the Middle East and took a lot of land and stuff, and that was that. Which to
How are
note,
they able to do that?
don't know. We didn't, from what I remember, what I was reading, it's not like they had really close ties to America at that time. It was something that seemed to happen more after the Six-Day War. And when they proved their strength, we became, America speaking, became interested in Israel as a force in the Middle East and
Right.
against Russia. Because remember, at that time, Moscow was providing weapons to Egypt and all that, and yet they still lost. From
Right.
what I
So
had read,
the Soviet Union was doing that, yes. And they
yeah.
were involved in the Middle East at that time.
hmm
So,
We we were both countries were heavily involved in the Middle East. I just don't know the exact specifics about how much we were involved with Israel because historically Britain was more involved, but
yeah.
then Britain wanted to pass that on to the UN and didn't want to be as involved. So I don't.
So
I'm
the US saw what happened there, and it's then that we thought, oh, we could use this part of the Middle East to be like a base for us, really.
well, yeah. I mean, it was basically a route in the Middle East that would basically ensure that Russia and the Soviets would just not be able to get a grasp on that land. And remember, the way I think of it is the Six-Day War was a military strike, and the Apollo mission was a psychological strike on the area. So it weakened them on both fronts to move countries away from Moscow
Mm,
and try to either isolate them or have them capitulate to the West. So,
that makes sense, yeah.
um, and something else worth noting is that the strike on the what was it, the USS Liberty, which there's stories around that,
Hmm.
happened during the Six-Day War. So just to fit
Yes.
that in.
Yes, the false flag issue.
Um,
Um,
should should I explain all the events of the Six-Day War for maybe those that don't know on like what happened and why was
yes,
it
because I
significant?
don't really know all the details to that either. So,
Yeah, that's fine. I have it in my notes here. So the Six-Day War took place from June 5th to 10th in 1967. And it was Israel versus an Arab coalition led by Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and a few others gave support, but they weren't like the main frontline forces. And so there was tensions building up to that point, to the lead. The USSR was heavily arming Egypt and Syria, and then Egypt closed the Strait of Tiran to Israeli shipping, considered an act of war by Israel. And at that time, Arab states were publicly making threats about destroying Israel and stuff like that. So, due to closing that strait, there was a preemptive strike where, basically Israel launched a surprise airstrike that wiped out most of Egypt's air force in a matter of hours. And this gave Israel superiority immediately. And so there was a lightning victory in just 6 days. Israel took the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip from Egypt. They captured the West Bank and East Jerusalem from Jordan, seized the Golan Heights from Syria, and additionally completely humiliated the Arab armies and their Soviet backers. And so, to understand the aftermath, that basically means Israel's territory grew by over 50% from that. So,
yeah, that's pretty shocking. So you're saying that the Sinai and Gaza Strip were actually under Egypt's rule.
Yeah.
And then Jerusalem and what was the other?
Uh, it was um it was uh it was the West Bank
Yeah, okay.
and East Jerusalem was a part of Jordan.
And East Jerusalem. Yeah. So that was actually part of Jordan. I didn't even know that.
Me neither.
So
uh,
I find that very interesting that it was owned by Jordan and Egypt, who
mhm,
have are very timid around Israel.
mhm.
They
And
don't want to get involved, which kind of makes sense now that you read that. Although I think Egypt is coming back from that. I think they're getting
mhm. Well, there's definitely um I would say attempts from the Middle East to try to strengthen, but obviously there's things that go into that and how all of that's playing in to try to stop all of that as well, but we'll get to that later. Um, so basically, that was the reason why that historical event is so important is it explains the trepidation of the Middle East towards Israel alone, not even counting, by the way, us backing them, which came more strongly after that war. So that tells us that something about Israel's pretty strong, stronger than I think most sources kind of explain. And I think it's really important context for why the Middle East is just so nervous. Because if you just tell me, oh, well, Israel's really strong and, they can defend themselves and stuff like that, I'm like, well, that's not really how it's painted out to me. And then but if you know this historical event, I'm like, okay, yeah, they can definitely hold their ground. They know what to do. They know
well,
what.
excuse me, I don't mean to interrupt, but considering what just happened with the big Arab Muslim summit meeting
Hmm.
where, a bunch of people showed up, not just those countries we mentioned, but, we had Iran, we even had Azerbaijan, we had Armenia, we had Turkey. All of those countries were also involved. And I know when I did this report, I was like, oh, they're not going to do anything. They're weak, but I didn't know why. So it's good that you told me about that.
Hmm.
And I thought to myself, well, they basically made some kind of agreement about, yes, Israel's being very aggressive. Yes, we have to do something about it.
Hmm.
I've listened to some analysts since then, and it seems like this is a little bit different than in past ones where they've been pretty timid, pretty
Hmm.
uh, pass not really wanting to be involved is basically what it is because
Hmm.
obviously they haven't been doing anything about Gaza, as we all know.
Well, we're seeing a kind of a repeat of this fight over the Middle East again between, we could say, Russia and China and working with Iran as their anchor. Really, the way I see it is you have the East working through Iran and the West working through Israel. And so those are kind of the two big roots of the Middle East, I would argue. Um, and so we're kind of seeing this this boldness coming about because you have two superpowers, I would argue, for Russia and China, basically standing up for, you know, in trying to fight instability in the Middle East, whether you agree with their methods or not. And the point is, that's what they see this as to a degree. So, and again, not to say they don't have their own motives, trade and stuff like that too. Just like we want the same things and we have our reasons for over there as well. I'm just saying it's a very complicated, messy area and has been historically. So,
So it's basically again the East versus the West.
well, yeah, basically it's another Russia versus US kind of thing with other powers surrounding them.
Right. Because sometimes people are confused on what if Russia is East or West, but even though it's considered part of Europe and Western, a lot of people think it's part of the East.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember learning in high school when I was in comparative government. It was my teacher asked, "Oh, is Russia a part of the East or is it part of Europe?" And all of us thought it was part of the East because nobody really treats them as a part of Europe. So
Yeah.
I think it really says a lot to how a lot of us think when we're growing up and learning in school. And even then, I kind of really don't consider them part of the West. They're very much Eastern in mindset and historical behavior.
And so we don't have any idea how Israel was able to, as you said, obliterate or beat these Arab countries or these, these countries.
I'm by what I was gathering, it seems like, Egypt was the kind of the hot spot of weapons and such from the Soviet Union. And so when Israel got rid of most of those planes and stuff in that Air Force, they basically had air superiority. And to understand at that time, um, air superiority was everything. If you had planes and such and you got the other side's planes out, that was really massive. I mean, and that was all started in like World War II with the air raids, and that's why those were so important because, as horrible as they were, that's what really helped with, forcing countries to capitulate.
So that was the turning point where, at least that, and you said the space race, that is a part of the turning point of how they decided that the Soviet Union was not as good a supporter or helper for them in that area against Israel, right?
Yeah, it was a humiliating defeat. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it was, I mean, the humiliation of being defeated and then, after placing their trust in Russia, which ended up in their eyes falling through, and then, the space race, which Russia was showing all this promise in, suddenly they're outmatched by the US. So, just bam, oh, you didn't achieve anything as impressive as this. So, you know,
I'm gonna it's something that just came to my mind. So this meeting right now that they had just a few days back, the Arab Summit thing, it was all because Qatar was hit
right.
by Israel. And you could say the same thing about how they must be feeling because America, who had their base right there, didn't stop it, didn't do anything.
Hmm.
So they could have the same feeling about America now as they did with the Soviet Union.
Yeah. The difference is I can't confirm or deny how many bases were actively there in the Middle East for Russia. I think they were in some areas, but I don't know how widespread. So,
I'm just
I,
saying that we consider, America considers, as we hear President Trump always saying, that Qatar was a U.S. ally because we were using that
oh,
as our and
right, right,
so
right. I get what you're
so
saying.
for me, if I were an Arab, no matter how I feel about some of them being corrupt and all that, the point is it's this it seems to me it's the same thing over again, except it's the opposite. It's
Well,
not the Soviets, it's now they're like, well, what are the Americans going to do for us if they're allowing us to be, and some of their people, their security people were killed. If they're doing that, why should we rely on them? They're really, how much protection do we actually have? If they have their base there and they didn't protect us, wouldn't they feel kind of vulnerable?
well, yeah, and also backstabbed.
Yeah,
I mean, it's like I always say, America is one of the last countries I would ever consider an alliance with because historically they've backstabbed time and time again. America is self-centered and interested in its own interests for better or worse. I mean, that's just
right,
how it
right.
is. So, if I were a country, I'd be very wary about what deals I make with the US. Not to say that, there is zero trust in us. There have been okay things, but historically speaking, there have been a lot of not great things. So,
Okay. So we go on from the space race and the Six-Day War,
hmm
and now we're going on with this because the Cold War obviously is going on still.
hmm
So where do we go from here to get to the 9/11 issue?
Well, this is where we can kind of start getting into um, talking more about remember just to reframe because there's a lot of stuff we're going over. APAC has been established for quite a long time by, you know, it almost 20 years by the time 1969 happens. So, not that it was always, super influential right away, but I'm just saying it's been around for about 20 years by that point. So, um, and again, after the Six-Day War, we saw the potential of Israel. We saw them as a really great force to have in the Middle East on our side, and we want to use them for our interests. I think there's this understanding that Israel is using us for things, and I'm not saying that isn't true, but I'm thinking it's a little bit bigger than that, where we definitely have some very strong beliefs and goals of which we have in the Middle East. And Israel is the perfect state of which represents democracy, of which we can use against communism. And if you look at it now, the war on terror, quote unquote, is very much framed very similarly as the fight against communism. And again,
Mm.
not saying that there aren't genuine concerns about terrorism, genuine concerns about communism. Those are very real concerns. But again, it's like I said earlier, like in the first part, there's a way to that something is factual, but you can take it to lead people towards something that, you want them to think. Not that their points aren't incorrect, but it can lead to very dangerous actions or misunderstandings when framed in a certain way. So, um, what we're seeing now, and kind of since we're kind of talking about modern events and stuff, is I believe the West is trying very hard to keep Russia, China, Iran, and BRICS busy. And, we don't want Russia deepening ties, especially with Iran and Syria. We don't want that again. We've,
Well,
and,
before you go on there, what happened after the collapse of the Soviet Union? Because if we don't have our rival anymore, what happened then?
well, that gets
What were we
into,
going to do then? What was our agenda? I mean, what did we have planned to do for that since
well,
they were gone?
there was a man by the name of Wolfowitz who passed a bill in Congress, which was basically stating along the lines of that we wanted to prevent a power basically like Russia rising up again, and having problems with our strategic interests, being places like Europe, the Middle East, Latin America, and stuff like that. And that was passed in 1992, I think we were seeing. And and basically you'll notice that's quite interesting that we were already kind of preparing for this almost inevitable return of some power, as if they were like ready for it. We want to be ready. We want to make sure that we're on top this time and we don't have a repeat of the Cold War where we're struggling. We want to make sure we shut it down immediately. Well, what was happening in the 1990s is Yeltsin was getting out and Putin was on the rise. And, you know, say what you will about him, but as I learned in comparative government in high school, the man did a lot for Russia that, was making it stand as its own nation again, very much like the Soviet Union, which of course appeals to the people of that country and understandably so. Um, and of course, as us in the West, we see that as a red flag that, uh-oh, Russia could possibly be on the rise and try to, create relationships and stuff and whatnot with the Middle East again, or powers that we don't want. Like for instance, we see us trying to shut down trade with Europe and Russia. Well, why? Well, it's stated in that bill that was passed. That's what we wanted to do. So again, I think it's very important to recontextualize 9/11 as a kind of catalytic moment to kind of push us into the Middle East sooner than we had probably initially planned. Because remember, we had bonds with Israel. We were giving them weapons. Intelligence was likely being shared, things like that. And so there wasn't really that much of a reason for us to race into the Middle East because Israel was kind of being that, you know, that route for us still. That said, um, and don't forget of course our regime changes and stuff that we had given there too. But all of that was changing because Iran also at that time was getting past all the stuff of which we meddled in and took over, changed their leadership and stuff like that, which under the Shah was friendly to Israel, which again, if you know anything about that, we helped install that person and we caused a lot of problems there too. Um, that was also something I learned in comparative government. Very interesting stuff. And yeah, so um, that's basically the gist of that. Unless you, I mean, I'm guessing you have questions as well on maybe where we should go from there. But of course, may have to pause and take a break for before we get to maybe
Yes.
another part.
We have to have one more part. Three is the magic number. But yes, I'd like to get into, well, what you were talking about with Wolfowitz. You're talking about the Wolfowitz doctrine. Yeah,
Hmm.
we looked into that a bit. And yes, it was how are we going to restructure what's happened since the Soviets' fall, everything geopolitically, it seems to
Hmm.
me.
Hmm.
So we can get more into 9/11, post 9/11, what that means to us on that issue. Because I always thought that was their excuse on their war on terror. And as we know, bin Laden was a asset of the CIA, so they were using him because we were actually backing them in the Afghan war against the Soviets. And they were
Hmm.
the Mujahideen then, but then they changed
Oh,
it to Al Qaeda, which I remember hearing that was actually the CIA that made up that name. So,
yeah. Well, also to kind of clarify on that, there's more evidence that suggests that he made the group himself and got involved, and then we funneled resources into him.
yes,
So he was
yes,
something that was already
yes.
established,
The
already,
Mujahideen was already there. In fact, it included part of the Taliban. So
yeah.
that's right. Yeah. So let's get more into that in the next part. That should be our wrap-up session. But in any case, thanks so much for watching. Thanks for much for following my channel. I hope you found this interesting. Of course, share your thoughts on either, any of these videos. Until next time, we'll be back later.